Treasurer, thanks very much for your time. Will you support Labor in those amendments?
No, we won't. JobKeeper is a remarkable program, Kieran. It's the single largest economic support measure that any Australian government has ever undertaken. And a key part of the success of JobKeeper has been these IR flexible arrangements. And around 80% of JobKeeper businesses have said they've been able to maintain their business through this crisis because of those IR flexibility. So we want them to continue.
Yeah, but why wouldn't you support this greater safety net? Because under this situation that you've got proposed to the Parliament at the moment, you could have a recovering business, a business doing better, but the employee receiving less than, say, a business that's been flattened, and yet the employee would still get the $600 JobKeeper subsidy.
So under the reforms, if you are continuing to be a JobKeeper business after the end of September, you'll maintain those IR flexible arrangements around duties, hours worked and location. If you're coming off JobKeeper, but your turnover is down between 10 and 30%, you'll be able to maintain those flexible arrangements, but you won't be able to reduce the hours worked below 60% as they were on the 1st of March. And it's critical to understand that these are still distressed businesses. So they can't keep all their employees fully employed because their doors are not necessarily fully open. And if we were to force those businesses to keep their staff working at 100% of hours, then ultimately that would cost jobs.
You could have some workers, though. Do you concede there could be some workers under that arrangement who would earn less with those reduced hours than if they were on JobKeeper?
But you're not comparing two of the same businesses. Ultimately, those businesses that those people are working for have seen their turnover fall between 10 and 30%, but they're no longer on JobKeeper. So they're still distressed, they're still coming back to work. Then there are the other set of businesses that maintain JobKeeper that are obviously more distressed and will continue to receive the full IR flexible arrangements.
So for the worker, it's better to be with the more distressed company.
But it's not about ensuring that the worker is getting exactly the same pay as that they were previously. It's about ensuring that they can maintain their job. And we have worked through these reforms with the unions and with the business groups, and they're an appropriate response.
It seems to make sense, though, the Labor amendment to the effect that you would provide the minimum $600 JobKeeper to everyone. Why not, given how distressed not just the businesses are, but the workers are too?
Well, we are maintaining JobKeeper for those businesses that have seen their turnover fall over the December quarter by more than 30% or by more than 50%, depending on the size of those businesses.
But not the recovering businesses.
But the recovering businesses are not receiving JobKeeper because they're recovering, but they're still distressed.
But shouldn't you put then, just to finish on this issue, why not put that safety net for those workers? Because if they're going to have their hours reduced, they're going to be earning less than JobKeeper reduced.
Ultimately, Labor's proposal could cost jobs because if you were to force an employer to pay someone even though there was not the work for them, then ultimately that could lead to more sackings.
The Treasury numbers suggest another 400,000 workers or thereabouts will lose their jobs by Christmas. Is this the time to be tapering JobKeeper at all?
Well, ultimately what we've done is extended JobKeeper by another 6 months. Originally it was legislated for 6 months and we're extending it, and at $101 billion it's the single largest program that Australia has ever undertaken.
But why reduce it?
Because ultimately we are seeing businesses come back. Outside of Victoria, the recovery is seeing, and restrictions are being eased and businesses are coming back. Labor themselves have said that this payment should transition, recognising it's not going to be there forever. So ultimately they were complaining, Labor, that people were being paid too much. Now they're saying they're not paid enough. They said before they complained about the debt levels. Now they're saying we need to spend more. Before they said that we should transition. Now they're saying we shouldn't transition. They want to have a bet each way.
But aren't we still in the teeth of the economic crisis? We
Absolutely.
saw this, the Herald Sun numbers today, up to $400 million a day. The stage 4 lockdown is costing Victoria. If we're in the teeth of the economic crisis, why wind back the supports?
Well, the reason for being the reason for extending this program by another 6 months is because there is still a long way to go in coming out of COVID-19. What we announced recently was effectively an extra $30 billion, Kieran, of spending on JobKeeper, with changes around the employer turnover test as well as the employee eligibility test.
But just to clarify that issue, though, because if we're in a situation where it's costing Victoria $400 million every day, we're in the teeth of the economic crisis, the recession continues. Why not sustain the supports longer at the levels that they're at?
Well, we are providing additional support. We've extended that support. JobKeeper is transitioning
Tapering
over time, and so too has been the coronavirus supplement. But when it comes to Victoria, that is obviously a devastating economic situation, and it's our estimates that up to nearly half of the private sector workforce in Victoria will be on JobKeeper.
National accounts out this week. What should we expect? How bad will these numbers be?
Well, the first thing to say is that Australia has been hit by an economic shock like no other, Kieran, and it's a hit on both the supply and the demand side. We've seen for the June quarter numbers in the UK, GDP down by more than 20%. We saw in France down by around 14%. We saw in the United States and Germany down by around 10%. The median market expectations here in Australia is for GDP to be down between 6 and 7%, and that's obviously based on lower household consumption, lower dwelling investment, lower business investment, and overall less economic activity.
So in terms of that economic activity, what was the message from the RBA governor when you met with the state treasurers on Friday?
Well, we talked about the various levers that we as treasurers and governments can control as part of this recovery. First, there's the income support, and it's fair to say there's been a huge focus on income support, whether it's through JobKeeper, 50% wage, apprentice wage subsidy, or other initiatives that have been undertaken. The second part of what we can control relates to aggregate demand. For example, bringing forward infrastructure projects, a housing package and the like. And the third is making it easier for business to hire people and to grow and to innovate, and that's cutting red tape, for example. Now, what the governor made very clear is that the states need to spend more. We as a Commonwealth have made commitments of around $314 billion, or about 15.8% of GDP. In comparison, the state contributions are around $48 billion, or just 2.4% of GDP. So he was reiterating what he had said previously at National Cabinet, which is that the states need to spend more.
The fundamental problem, though, at the moment is undermining all of that are the state border closures. Is JobKeeper allowing the states to keep their borders closed? I mean, is this having a perverse impact where the federal support is allowing some of the states to keep the borders shut?
Well, JobKeeper is absolutely necessary to maintain that formal connection between employers and employees and to get them to the other side. With respect to borders, I think there's too much confusion and ultimately too much cruelty in the way that their borders have been closed. What we need is more compassion. What we need is more common sense. And it's just inexplicable that a school teacher from Victoria, which is 2 kilometres away from the South Australian border, is deemed not to be an essential worker. It's inexplicable that a mother can lose their child because of confusion as to how they can access a hospital in Brisbane. Reports today of a young 4-year-old boy with a relapse of cancer who's being separated from their mother, a couple who are going through IVF treatment and at risk of losing their eggs. There is some terrible stories of hardship. That's why the Prime Minister has made it very clear that we will be proceeding with a definition of hotspots, of what a hotspot is.
And so what should define a hotspot? What sort of number are we talking about? Andrew touched on it earlier in the program. To reopen the borders, what are you looking at? What
Well,
sort
it's
of
going to be
frame?
based on medical advice. It's going to have clear metrics. It's going to be transparent, and it's obviously going to lead to a more targeted response. And that's been worked through by the Chief Medical Officer and ultimately through the AHPPC. And it will be looking at what is the number of cases, what are the location of those cases, what is the source of the particular, what is the source of that particular outbreak.
What happens if you come up with a target and Queensland and WA still don't sign up? What then?
Well, ultimately, those jurisdictions have got questions to answer when it comes to the operation of their borders, because what we can't see is people being denied medical treatment. What we can't see is our economic recovery being hindered by that very strict interpretation around borders by the states.
Speaking of strict interpretation, what about Daniel Andrews, the idea of a 12-month extension of the emergency, the state of emergency? You expressed concern about that. We're seeing now the other toll, 400 million every day. What do you want to see from Daniel Andrews in terms of the way out of this thing?
I want to hear more about a message of hope for the people of Victoria. Daniel Andrews and the Victorian government need to be talking more about the road out than about a longer road in. It was real overreach when it came to the 12-month extension of emergency powers that he was seeking. There's been a litany of failures in Victoria. Obviously, quarantine is the most graphic of that, and we've heard expert evidence to the inquiry that 99% of cases in the second wave in Victoria can be traced back to those quarantine failures. The rejection of the ADF support, testing and tracing, which is not as good as it is in other states, and of course now the overreach with emergency powers. And you've heard from no less a body than the Australian Medical Association that what has transpired in Victoria has been like a slow car crash that everyone has been witnessing as it is occurring. It is devastating what has happened in Victoria, and we're only 2 weeks away, Kieran, we're only 2 weeks away from the end of the so-called stage 4 restrictions. And businesses are in the dark as to how they will get their workers back and their doors open. Kids need to know when and if they are going back to school. In Victoria, families are subject to lockdown 23 hours a day. You can't move more than 5 kilometres from your home. There's a curfew at night. These are the strictest of restrictions, taking a huge toll on people's mental health, but also on the economy.
So did Daniel Andrews essentially have a complete tin ear when he suggested 12 months, when people are already going through this sort of turmoil?
It was a very bad call. And I think it ignored the pleas of Victorians
and
for
health
him
concerns,
to show a way out.
But there are health concerns on the other side of this as well, aren't they? From adolescent mental health right through. Is he not getting the full picture here?
Well, as I said, there's been a litany of failures in Victoria. There are lots of questions that need answered. Unfortunately, Victorians are being told the inquiry will not come back with its findings until November. In the meantime, hundreds of people have lost their lives and hundreds of thousands are expected to lose their jobs.
There's a broad consensus that the status quo on tax, on industrial relations, that it's just not going to work in terms of the recovery. You're working on the budget now ahead of October. There's also some doubt whether this government has the stomach for reform. Will you be bold? Do you have the determination to be delivering bold reform to help deliver this recovery? Because as Dominic Perrottet, I've quoted him before to you, he says it's not an opportunity, it's an obligation to undertake reform.
Well, the first thing to say is the budget is about getting people back to work. We're in, as you say, we're still in the middle of a once-in-a-100-year crisis, and we're seeing unemployment expected to reach around 10% by the end of the year, and according to the RBA and Treasury, remaining elevated for some time. So we've got to help get people back to work while guaranteeing the essential services that people rely on, while ensuring the resilience of the country, be it national security, be it supply chains, be it a sustainable environment. And when it comes to reforms, we already have very significant reforms underway. We're abolishing a whole tax bracket. we're going to see 94% of Australian taxpayers pay a marginal rate of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. We have seen just the other day reach agreement with the states around harmonising occupational licensing, something that we've been talking about for more than a decade, which will be key to labour mobility as part of the recovery.
You need to go bigger than that, though, don't you?
And the budget will continue to have more reforms in it. But obviously, what we are focusing on is getting people back to work. That's our key.
So people shouldn't doubt you in terms of your determination to pursue the sort of reform, once-in-a-generation reform, really, that the country needs.
Well, those reforms are occurring all the time right now, whether it's on tax, whether it's on superannuation, whether it's on skills, whether it's on infrastructure. We are undertaking significant reforms.
The Treasury
right
Secretary's past, and others, and many others are saying that you need to change the whole structure of the tax system, for example. You're not talking anything like that.
Well, again, tax is a focus for us, but when it comes to the tax system, what we're doing right now is implementing the most significant reforms in more than 20 years.
On China, you've blocked the sale of Lion Dairy to the Chinese company Mengniu Dairy. They already own Bellamy's, Burra Foods in Victoria. Why did you block that sale? Because apparently Lion Dairy is already owned by a foreign company, a Japanese company.
Well, to be clear, they have withdrawn their offer after I made it initially clear to them that I didn't consider it to be in the national interest, and I had some concerns about it. Now, when it comes to the national interest, we don't talk about the details and the specifics of individual cases, but there are lots of factors that a Treasurer takes into account in determining the national interest. That can be the tax implications, competition implications, national security implications, the character of the investor, and of course the impact on both the economy and the community. But the business in question had a very significant market presence. You would know many of its labels, whether it's Pura, Big M, Yoplait, berry juices, Daily Juice and the like.
But do you need to provide more clarity in order to not have a cooling effect on foreign investment?
Well, there are some foreign investment deals that I approve and others that I don't.
So it's not just because it was from China?
They're dealt on individual cases. They're based on the facts before me. I've approved many investments from China, so it's not country specific. It's about the individual facts around a particular case.
On the Belt and Road Agreement between the States and China, that announcement by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister this week, does that risk further antagonising China at a time when obviously there's a lot of tension between the two nations?
Well, Kieran, we've made very clear from the start with respect to Belt and Road that we haven't supported as a federal government. Now, the expertise sits within the Department of Foreign Affairs. It doesn't in Canberra. It doesn't sit in Spring Street or in other capital cities. And so it's only appropriate that we continue to make decisions around foreign relations. And I saw that a distinguished figure, none other than Dennis Richardson, the former head of the Department of Foreign Affairs, saying that it was a sensible approach, and we would expect bipartisan support on this.
And last issue I want to ask you before you go, is the government committed to the increase in the superannuation guarantee next year? Will you deliver that as legislated?
Well, we're considering the issue, bearing in mind that we are in the middle of a crisis, and we've heard from a range of figures, including the head of the Reserve Bank, the Governor of the Reserve Bank recently, when he said that ultimately an increase in the superannuation guarantee will mean lower wages. Lower wages means lower income. Lower income means less spending means less jobs. And so ultimately what we have to consider is the timing of that particular issue.
Sounds like you'll delay it further.
Well, we're considering it, and you've heard whether it's from ACOS, whether it's from the Grattan Institute, whether it's from the RBA, whether it's from the Small Business Association, that you've heard their concerns about the superannuation guarantee issue. But let me say, superannuation is a good thing, and it is a massive asset for the nation. But what the SG, the superannuation guarantee, is expected to do is increase next year, and that's not a decision that is to be made right away.
And the early access, though, hasn't it wiped out many people's super?
Early access has been a wonderful success. 2.8 million Australians have reached into their super at a time of hardship. It's an expansion of an existing scheme, and there are many great stories of how it's helped people get through COVID-19.
Treasurer, as always, I appreciate your time. A busy time for you. It doesn't stop. Thanks.
Thank you.